thank you to all of you for joining us here today. It's a very important moment in the year for Amnesty International, the global launch of our annual report. In 2011, what we saw in every region of the world was people, ordinary people, standing up to demand from their leaders their rights and demanding justice, accountability, and dignity. And the message from these people who stood up in the face of bullets, beatings, and tanks was very clear, that it's not business as usual anymore for tyranny and injustice. It was a clear human rights wake-up call to leaders both in government and in business. Now, in sharp contrast to this, unfortunately, what we saw was an appalling failure of leaders themselves to respond to this call. What we saw was this call falling simply on deaf ears. So the call to put justice before profits and rights before repression didn't seem to have the impact that we expected. And I must say again that this is not just in the Middle East and North Africa. This is from Moscow to Lilongwe to New York to La Paz. In every region of the world, protests were met with repression, with excessive force. So what we've said is that failed leadership last year went global. Now the most pressing example, the most tragic example of this indifference and failed leadership at the international level is that of what has happened with Syria. Thousands of lives had to be lost and sacrificed in Syria before the Security Council could come up with a feeble resolution which resulted in a handful of observers finally being put into Syria. Now, as you know, Amnesty International and many other agencies have been publishing and documenting reports saying that what has happened in Syria is effectively crimes against humanity. But the Security Council just watched for months and months. Our first report, I think, came out over a year ago. Now, we know very well the reason for this is that Russia has been selling arms to the Syrian government, and China is backing Russia. Now, this behavior of Security Council members is not new. So the Americans, we know, have for decades effectively shielded governments in the Middle East. We know the case of Egypt and the US and Egypt. We have the French and the Tunisians. And even as we speak, we have the Americans and the British government looking the other way when it comes to human rights violations in Bahrain or Saudi Arabia. Of course, 75% of the arms in the world exported actually come from the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. A very unfortunate and worrying reality right now is that the new emerging powers, Brazil, India, South Africa, are also starting to behave in the same way. On the one hand, talking about lofty ideals of democracy, human rights, and values of that nature, but in practice, taking care of their narrow political, commercial interests. So our concern really is that can we actually see some real leadership emerging in 2012? Now, as it happens, and our report really is outlining all the possibilities of this happening, but apart from the failed leadership at the global level, I also want to mention here that the report identifies that over 90 countries in 2011 have restricted freedom of expression. Over 2/3 of the countries, the security forces in these countries continue to torture their detainees, ill-treat their detainees. This is something which is in the country entries and in the regional overviews. I think of course, so effectively what we see is that there are some very big challenges facing us in 2012. Now, but before we get too cynical, the report reminds us that we've also seen some incredible progress in 2011. And that progress, which a lot of it has happened because of pressure from below, gives us real hope for 2012 as well. So if we were standing in January 2011 and having this conversation, who could have predicted that 4 heads of state in the Middle East and North Africa, Yemen, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, would not be around by the end of the year? Who could have predicted that Daw Suu Kyi would be contesting for elections and hundreds of prisoners would have been released in Myanmar? In fact, From 2003, Amnesty International has not been able to send a delegation, and right now, as we speak, we have a delegation in Myanmar. In Latin America, in several countries in Latin America, to name a few, Guatemala, Colombia, Bolivia, and most recently Brazil as well, have opened up investigations or trials to bring those who've caused human rights abuses in the past to account. In Africa, we've had the trial, conviction and trial of the two cases that you very well know. One of Thomas Lubanga, that's the first of the ICC after 10 years of work, I think, something which Amnesty International worked on as well for a long time. We finally have a clear result in the case of Lubanga. And the case of Charles Taylor, the previous president of Liberia, again, many of you know this case. Finally, some hope for international justice and progress for human rights in Africa. And one of the things which I like to say also is that for the first time in Egypt, as we are meeting here, we have the Egyptian elections taking place. And for the first time, we actually don't know who the president is likely to be in Egypt. Because in all previous elections, we always knew who the president was going to be. So there's some good positive steps. So I think for us, going back to the question of failed leadership, if we look ahead to 2012, we believe that the UN Arms Trade Treaty Conference, which is going to happen in July in New York, presents a real opportunity for international leadership to redeem itself. For the first time, we have a chance of making sure that arms do not reach the hands of those governments who could use it for human rights abuses. There's a real opportunity. And we do hope that the leaders will actually stand up to their responsibility for the first time. Let's not forget that the Security Council is meant to be maintaining peace and security of the world as a whole. They are meant to be serving the interests of all the member states, not only their self-interest. So this is a real opportunity for the emerging economies, the most powerful countries in the world, to stand up and be counted and to actually match up to the demands of millions of people across the world. These most powerful countries have to recognize that a secure, stable, prosperous future can only be built on human rights foundations, on the foundations of justice. And if they don't get one lesson, the one lesson which is clear to me anyway from 2011, is that leaders who don't respect human rights, leaders who do not want to be accountable, will not be accepted anymore. So if they don't listen to this lesson, it's going to be at their own peril. And Amnesty International makes a strong commitment that we will be on this case. We will be making sure that they stay accountable to human rights. So thank you very much.